Thank you, Michael. It's great to be here with so many friends and so many people who are living a life of purpose. And just for fun, would anyone who is living a life that is driven by purpose raise their hands at the moment? Look around you and see who is in the room. Is this incredible or what? Thank you all for being here. I don't know why you're not up here on stage instead of me. Supposedly this will do something. Great. Oh, go back a little bit. Well, maybe I'll just start with a story. So I'll tell you a story about somebody who's living a life of purpose. This is Elizabeth Whalen. She was just starting school, and she was wandering around in the lab. She works, or at that time, she worked for Columbia Forest Products, which is the manufacturer of the biggest manufacturer of hardwood plywoods in the country. And she was wandering around in the labs, and she stumbled across a soy-based glue, a non-toxic glue that could replace formaldehyde glues in plywood. Now, formaldehyde is a carcinogen. And so all of a sudden, something happened to her, which is she hadn't been looking for a purpose, but she found a purpose. And her purpose was to get rid of this nasty chemical and replace it with something else. And she became very obsessed with this and began working on it. What happened was that it wasn't actually easy to sell this idea. The industry was set against her because, after all, they knew how to use formaldehyde glues. They didn't know how to use this new glue. They had to go through the process of getting it through building codes and so forth. But people were dying of cancer, and she had to do something about it. And the harder she pushed, the bigger the backlash. It became actually personally nasty, with people writing articles about what a bad person she was and writing articles about how bad the company was. And this began to really hurt. And she said, I'm really not sure how I continued at this point because, well, I was in school, I had a full-time job, and I got pregnant at the same time. And yet, somehow she continued working on this. And I asked her what kept her going, and she said, well, purpose is what pulled me through. This thing which had grabbed me, this thing which I wasn't expecting at all, that I wasn't looking for, this sense that I really had something that I had to do with my life, and that this was what I was meant to do, and that actually this was not going to happen unless I made it happen. And so she carried on. And she built an alliance with nonprofits and other groups and began beating on the regulators in California, which seemed to be a soft spot. And then the Environmental Protection Agency passed an ordinance against formaldehyde glues in plywood. And now, well, Columbia Forest Products was the only company that could sell plywood in California. And actually, that's quite a business advantage when you come right down to it, right? And they, being a good company, they licensed this glue to other plywood companies. But the Chinese, who were moving into the plywood market very rapidly, did not figure this out and did not have this new glue. And so suddenly, all the plywood companies in the United States were doing a much bigger business in California than they had before. And she said, this changed my whole life. And she said personal growth, which she spent quite a lot of time at when she was in school, she said personal growth is really about finding something bigger than yourself and committing yourself to something bigger than yourself. And this gave me a deep feeling of satisfaction. And it shaped my whole career. So what do we learn from this? First of all, we learn that having people in your organization who are driven by purpose actually is a good thing for business. They may be a little hard to control. They may get out of hand from time to time. But actually, they push through and make great things happen. And so we're here in part to celebrate that purpose. And because it gave her, as you can see, the kind of courage and persistence she needed to go against really nasty opposition and push through. And of course, purpose attracted the allies because she wouldn't have been able to get all those nonprofits on board with her if it wasn't for the fact that she was emanating through her pores a strong sense of purpose. And finally, I think it's kind of interesting that you don't even have to go out and seek a purpose. You simply have to ready your soul to the point where you will receive one when you run into it. And I think that's something important to think about. Now, this is Viktor Frankl, who wrote a book about his experiences in the concentration camp when life was really as rough as life can get. And he tells a story of walking down a road with being pushed along by soldiers with rifle butts banging on them and slogging through the mud. And he said, you know, the only thing that kept me going at that point was a picture of my wife. And I realized that at the core of purpose is love. And that love of something is what makes us dedicate our lives to doing a really good job about doing something. In his case, the good job was surviving and helping the other people in the concentration camp. And to be fully human, he said, is to find a deeper meaning in our lives. And the relationship, I was going to talk about the relationship between meaning and purpose, but I think it's so obvious that the two are deeply connected that I'll just leave that part to you. In the search for meaning, he warns against pursuing shallow goals like affluence, hedonism, or materialism. And so the question really is, what really matters to you? If we can answer that question, we can live lives of purpose. But of course, I don't need to tell you about that because you're all living lives of purpose. So what does it mean to be fully human? You know, all these goddamn pictures, they all are about men. I had a real difficulty finding this picture. Well, I'll let you find your own answers, and I'll just, there's a lot of things that make people human, but it's really about caring for others, caring for the planet, things like that. And unfortunately, our civilization has glorified action without deeper purpose. And we have to ask ourselves, where are we going if we do that? Back in 1970, Milton Friedman wrote an article in the New York Times Review of Books, the New York Times Review, and said, if it costs shareholders 1 penny, protecting the environment or helping the poor is stealing from shareholders for your selfish personal aims. Now, think about that. If that's the principle on which we're running business, and I must tell you, when I talk to graduates of business schools and I say, what did you learn in your ethics class? They say, well, I learned the Friedman Principle, which of course removes all responsibility. It's an interesting thing to teach in ethics. But what would happen if we put the Friedman Principle into action? Well, so one thing he talks specifically about is, well, if you care about pollution, for example, don't deal with that. Don't work on eliminating pollution at work. What you do is you take the money you're earning at work, working for the shareholders, and then afterwards you use that money to go clean up the pollution which you created while you were at work. And this kind of violates the principle of entropy. Physics doesn't support this idea. You can see the ink, we're on an ink day, right? The ink is going into that glass, and look what's happening. It's dispersing. And it takes a lot of energy to get that ink out of the glass and back into the bottle, way more energy than it would to not put it in there in the first place. And so what we have is a principle in the way in which we run our businesses, which is actually in violation of the laws of physics. I don't think that's a good idea. So business is the dominant institution of our time. When I was a kid, nuns ran hospitals. Now big corporations do. When I was a kid, idiosyncratic families ran newspapers. Now big corporations do. When I was a kid, legislators wrote laws. Now lobbyists do. Something has changed, and one institution has become way more important in our society, controlling many, many aspects of what's going on. And it's rather important that if that much power is located in a single institution, that it takes a broader idea of responsibility. So I ask you, what would happen if we had a society that was governed by the Friedman Principle? Would we get financial meltdowns, environmental disasters, growing poverty? These things might happen. It would be better if we had a society that was governed by deep purpose. The interesting thing is that the Friedman Principle doesn't even work if all you're interested in is the single bottom line. Jim Collins and Jerry Porras wrote Built to Last, and they studied corporations which have been successful over a long period, not the ones that have a quick run up in stock and then crash, but the ones that just keep going. And interestingly enough, they said that those organizations were driven by a deeper sense of purpose than just making money. And that it was that deeper sense of purpose which directed them in ways that made them enduring. So even if all you were interested in was the single bottom line, the Friedman Principle would actually be a very bad way to run a business. So what we need is managers with deeper purpose. Bill Grace visited BGI, and this is what happened. All these students are holding up little signs saying, "Not for sale." When we graduate, we're not going to sell out. We're going to actually live lives of purpose, and that's what we need. Here's someone who lived a life of purpose. This is Kevin Moss. He's a third-generation dairy farmer. He's concerned about two things. One, family farms are going out of business. And two, he's concerned about the pollution that's coming out of dairy farms. The manure goes out, it enters a large lagoon. The manure goes down into the groundwater and poisons people's wells. Methane bubbles up into the atmosphere. Smells go over to the neighbors, which are increasingly suburban. And the EPA begins finding the dairy farms, and they go out of business. So he looked at that whole thing as one system. And he said, what can I do about it? And here's the beginning of his answer. What you see is a giant concrete pad. Those little colored dots are people. It's about an acre in size. And it takes the manure from 2,000 cows, takes the methane, puts it through that generator, and produces 700 kilowatts of power continuously. This works out nicely because the methane is captured, there's nothing going into the groundwater. He gives back a nice dry bedding that's worth $100,000 to the farmers. He gives them a soil amendment they can spread on their fields. But even more, or in addition, he was highly profitable. So he built another one and added a greenhouse to use the waste heat. He's now on his fifth. Every time he wants to build another one, investors step up, because following this particular purpose gave him a kind of creativity that actually makes money for everyone. So here again, we see some of the same lessons coming. Purpose is driving profitable innovation. It's interesting that in this case, he had two completely separate purposes, and that one of those purposes appealed to one group of people, and another of those purposes appealed to another group of people. The investors were on the environmental side, the farmers were on keeping family farms in business side, and he made it all work. This is Tom Carpenter, who grew up in Cincinnati. As a young man, he was fighting the nukes. He had a kind of awakening when his family farm, when he discovered that the family farm from which his milk was coming was on a military reservation, and the cows were contaminated with radiation. And he decided to take a stand for public health and safety. He became attorney, and he began working with whistleblowers. Well, he worked for the Government Accountability Project, but then not liking exactly what he was doing, which is just suing people, didn't seem to be the answer. He went to OSR to learn management skills. What he learned was much deeper. He learned about systems change and inner work as a leader. He formed the Hanford Challenge, put together conversations with all the opposing forces at Hanford, and they came up with a common vision and a common purpose as to where they were going together. Maybe they didn't agree on everything, but they had some things they agreed on. That they needed long-term solutions that didn't depend upon, say, 1,000 years of careful custodianship, that they needed to put things away so that they didn't need people to take care of them anymore, and that they had to do something about their groundwater issues, which you can see in this picture, the spreading radioactivity at Hanford. The Department of Energy came up with a plan, and the community rose up and said, this plan is not good enough because we have a common vision, a common purpose here that we are going to go. Sure, there are still tough issues, but it's safer now as a result of that. I'll skip through the lessons because you can see them there. We find purpose through personal growth. We find it by thinking about who we love. We find it by choosing a place to stand. My last story, this is Dawn Danby. She had a long commitment to the environment. She's an industrial designer. And she was designing designs that were bringing sustainability into the world, but she said, that's not enough. I've got to do more than just my own designs. Dawn is, according to Fast Company, one of the 10 most creative women in business. Where was she going to go to work? She found a company that had a purpose that aligned with hers. Which is Autodesk, to help people imagine, design, and create a better world. They got Dawn because of that. She went to work, she put sustainability into the design tools, she worked with many other people to make that happen. And here's an example of one of the products she came up with. What you see is a 3D modeling program. That's typical of Autodesk, these sorts of things. What Dawn and her people added was an eco-materials advisor, which you see up here. She partnered with a group called Granta in order to have a database, which is the environmental aspects of all these materials. Click on this material here, go over here, click on ABS plastic, and look at the different ABSs you could use. And down here comes out the environmental and economic impact of those things. Immediately, as you're designing, you can figure all this out. So a 30% reduction in electricity and CO2, a better, maybe about a 25% reduction in cost. It actually didn't do much about water consumption. Again, we see deep, deep purpose, really helpful for business. That purpose is a really great tool for collaboration, and you see that actually the better people are, the more talent they have, the more they feel that they can do something that matters, the more important it is that they have purpose in their work. And so if you want great people working for you, you have to have and show a purpose which is deeper than just making money. Sometimes I get discouraged. I look at all the things that we need to do, and it seems like we're not keeping up. This is I've used climate change here as an example. There's growing trends. Probably you've been aware of the fact that we have a climate change problem for a while, and yet civilization doesn't seem to be responding. Oh, sure, there are little things that are going on, little prototypes of things that are better. We have a prototype here of what a business school should be. But it's not really changing everything in the world as much as we want to. What Rosabeth Moss-Kanter says, that this is typical and not to worry too much, because what happens is then we have a precipitating event. Something happens that wakes people up. And when that happens, society takes notice of the problem in a deeper way for the first time. And the next thing you know, you have a scale up and mainstream adoption. So if you feel that your purpose-driven activities in the world are not necessarily big enough to make all the change which is necessary to happen, I want you to have a warm feeling that when the shit hits the fan, those models are going to be very useful. Thank you very much.